Hello. Today we are going to start looking at the central nervous system. The central nervous system makes up the brain and the spinal cord. Cephalization, it's how our brain developed. It's functionally how it evolved to what we have today to think, process, learn different activities. So, when our brain developed, our brain began as part of the neural tube in utero. And part of that neural tube ends up making three different vesicles that turns into the different parts of the brain. We have the proencephalon, which becomes the forebrain, the mesencephalon, that becomes the midbrain, and the rhomencephalon, or the hindbrain. The back end of that all becomes our spinal cord. So those three primary vesicles, they give rise to five secondary vesicles. Well, that midbrain doesn't divide. It stays the way it is. But that hindbrain will become the metencephalon and the myelencephalon. That telencephalon will be your right and left cerebral hemispheres. The diencephalon, your epithalamus, thalamus, hypothalamus, and even the retina will come from that diencephalon. The mesencephalon, as we said before, the midbrain doesn't change. Well, that mesencephalon stays as the midbrain. The metencephalon becomes that pons and cerebellum. The myelencephalon becomes that medulla oblongata. And then we have ventricles throughout our brain as well. We'll go into what every part of this does. So here's the picture of all of this happening. We start in picture A with that neural tube. It starts out as a straight tube that starts to turn into the proencephalon, the mesencephalon, and the rhombencephalon. That proencephalon divides further to that telencephalon and the diencephalon. The mesencephalon stays the same. Well, that rhombencephalon comes that metencephalon and the myelencephalon. And then again, they change some more to become the primary structures of our brain we have today. So remember how when we looked at the skull, I know we looked at pictures of the fetal skull and how their skull is not completely sutured together. There's spaces in that skull. It's because your brain actually grows faster than your skull does. So as your brain grows, it causes that skull to kind of stretch around it. And then as the bone keeps adding around, it becomes eventually a full skull. That happens, the skull kind of mostly solidifies by about 5, but those bones are still going to keep growing until adulthood. So that forebrain that we had, that's going to move towards that brain stem, because our brain stem has a lot of very important functions. So our brain stem is made up of that midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. Our cerebral hemispheres come back and around, and they take over, they come over top of that diencephalon and that midbrain. And then we start to get all those creases and foldings that you familiar with a brain, that a brain actually has. So here's, again, those same first pictures. Here is where our brain, we get our adult brain. And then we have canals through our brain. So we have lateral ventricles, we have a third ventricle, a cerebral aqueduct, fourth ventricle, and a central canal. And that central canal goes all the way through that spinal cord. So here's how the brain actually fully develops. This is by week 5 after fertilization. It happens pretty quickly, because you think 5 weeks, that's not a lot of time. You can see all the different parts of the brain where everything is going to start coming in. Then we start to get something by week 13 that somewhat resembles a brain. It starts to look more like a brain than, say, this picture does. This is where we start to get those cerebral hemispheres. Then here's what the brain looks like at birth. It still has all the same adult patterns and structures. You still see that diencephalon, that cerebellum at the bottom. We have that midbrain in there, the pons, the medulla oblongata. They all make up our brain, and every part of our brain has specific functions. So by the time we're an adult, our brain has different regions. We're going to have our cerebral hemispheres. We have a right and a left cerebral hemisphere. We still keep that diencephalon. And then we have a brain stem. This is what comes down to eventually form that spinal cord. We have a midbrain, a pons, that medulla, and then we have a cerebellum. So our brain, not only does it have those specific parts to it, but it has ways that it is actually arranged. And you can see that on a brain based off of the neurons. We looked at neurons in the last chapter. So now we're going to look at how those neurons work within this nervous system. Because in our brain, just like our spinal cord, when we get to the spinal cord, we'll look at that as well. But our brain, we have what is called gray matter. Gray matter is those non-myelinated neurons. Remember those neurons? This is one of my neurons. It's got these myelinated sheaths on them. Gray matter they are not myelinated. The white matter, what makes up the white matter is more myelinated neurons, but we still get some non-myelinated neurons in there as well. So our brain has kind of a pattern of white matter and gray matter. So that central cavity, central cavity, so it's central, it's in the middle. It's surrounded by gray matter. White matter is external to that gray matter. As I said, the spinal cord also has that white and gray matter to it, except the pattern changes a little bit. The brainstem has more gray matter because they have specific nuclei. Nuclei are certain parts of the brain or brainstem that do specific jobs. We'll look at some of those today when we look with the central nervous system, but we're not going to look at all of them. We'll look at some of them. Then we have those cerebral hemispheres, which are called cerebrum. Then we have the cerebellum. The cerebellum and the cerebrum have an outer layer of gray matter that is, of course, called our cortex. So here, this is a slice of the spinal cord. You can see the gray matter here in that middle. Then the white matter is all on the outside, which are mostly myelinated neurons or axons of those neurons. Here is the brainstem. You can see the different parts of gray matter throughout with white matter surrounding it. All of these parts of gray matter make up some of the different nuclei that do specific jobs. Like some of these nuclei help with breathing, just making sure you are breathing, making sure you're getting enough oxygen, make sure you have enough oxygen to flow through your blood. And here's our brain. You see the gray matter all around the outside with the white matter kind of in the middle, but then you see other kind of spots of dark matter throughout. Those are some other nuclei in the brain that do specific jobs. You also see cavities or opening areas. Those are ventricles. Those open spots, those ventricles all do specific kinds of jobs or tasks. Or they may circulate and make that cerebral spinal fluid. So let's look exactly what those ventricles do. Those ventricles, as I said, they're filled with fluid. It's called that cerebral spinal fluid. All of the ventricles are lined, remember those ependymal cells or neuroglial cells? It's the same cell, just two different names. They are lined with that. They have those little finger-like projections on them that help kind of move things along. Those are lining all of our ventricles. We have two lateral ventricles. Those are the ones that we see right here. Those are those lateral ventricles. We have one on each hemisphere, one on the right and one on the left. Each lateral ventricle is, if you notice this part in the middle, they have a little septum down the middle. That septum is called septum pellucidum. That septum is what separates that right and that left lateral ventricles. So those lateral ventricles, they're going to connect to the third ventricles. We have a foramen. Remember a foramen from our bones? It's still the same thing in our brain. A foramen is a hole or an opening. So we have an interventricular foramen. That's what helps connect the lateral ventricle to the third ventricle. That third ventricle is in the diencephalon. And then, just like the lateral ventricle connects to the third ventricle, that third ventricle is going to connect to the fourth ventricle. That fourth ventricle is connected to the third ventricle via that vertebral aqueduct. The fourth ventricle, that's going to be found in that hind brain. And that vertebral aqueduct, that tells you, well, it's got to go down into the vertebral column somehow, because the names usually tell you about where it's going, where it's at. Well, that fourth ventricle is continuous with the central canal of the spinal cord. So we have that spinal cord. We have that kind of butterfly-like pattern in it. And then in here, we have that circle in the middle. That's our central canal. Is there right in the middle. So the fourth ventricle also is connected with other places. We have what is called the subarachnoid space, and that's what surrounds the entire brain. So we have cerebral spinal fluid all around our brain, between our brain and what we're going to talk about shortly, meninges that are around between the skull and the brain. We've got cerebral spinal fluid throughout that as well. We have lateral apertures and a median aperture at the roof. Lateral is at the lateral ends. So here is all the ventricles in blue. We have this lateral ventricle. That is the big portion. This whole thing through here is the lateral ventricle. It's like through here, this is the lateral ventricle. These lateral ventricles, as we said, they connect to the third ventricle. How do they connect to that third ventricle? Interventricular foramen. You can see it from the different parts. Those interventricular foramens leads to that third ventricle. From the side, that third ventricle almost looks like a bird's head, at least to me. But that's that third ventricle. And that third ventricle is connected to the fourth ventricle via that cerebral aqueduct. And that gets us to that fourth ventricle. Here is that fourth ventricle here, but you can see that fourth ventricle better from the anterior view. That fourth ventricle has openings at that lateral aperture that helps to send cerebral spinal fluid out and around your brain here. And that fourth ventricle also sends cerebral spinal fluid down to the central canal of the spinal cord. So let's look at the cerebral hemispheres. These cerebral hemispheres make up most of the brain. It is the most superior part of your brain. It surrounds any of the parts found in the middle, and it's about 83% of your brain's mass. That's quite a bit is found in those cerebral hemispheres. We have what are called gyri. Those are the ridges, the upper portion. We have sulci. That is the part that divots down. Then we have what are called fissures. Fissures are really deep grooves that separate different parts out. Like we have a longitudinal fissure. That's what gives us that right and left hemisphere. We also have a transverse cerebral fissure. That's what separates that cerebrum from the cerebellum. So let's look. Here is a real brain. You see this longitudinal fissure. That longitudinal fissure goes right down the middle. And that gives us the right cerebral hemisphere and the left cerebral hemisphere. You see all these gyri. These are the parts that are up. The sulci. Those are the parts in between the gyri. All of this is what helps to make up our brain. Here is a lateral view, because at that lateral view, you can see the cerebellum with that transverse cerebral fissure through the middle here, or through that, not necessarily the middle, but through that portion. So each of our hemispheres are divided even further. This is why we learned the bones of the skull. There's a reason for that. Frontal lobe, of course, that's going to be underneath the frontal bone. Parietal lobes, those are under the parietal bones. The temporal lobe, well, that's under the temporal bone. And the occipital lobe, that's underneath the occipital bone. They relate. The one other part we have is called the insula. So as I said, they're named for the bones lying over them. The insula is deeper. So you don't see the insula if you're looking at the whole brain. Like from here or here, you don't see the insula. The insula is kind of deep in this area. You can kind of see it through here, deep. If you pull these lobes apart, you're going to find that insula. So here's a picture that shows each of the different lobes. You have that frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe in dark blue, occipital lobe in light blue. You still have that cerebellum. You can also see the gyri or gyrus, which is that ridge, that part that goes up. Well, that fissure is a deeper sulcus, but here is that sulcus. It's not so deep. Here is that insula. I told you it was deep to that area. It is deep to that frontal, parietal, and temporal lobes. So our brain, of course, is made up of different sulci. Because these certain sulci are what separates the different lobes. So they're deeper down because we need a way to separate the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. from the temporal lobe, from the occipital lobe. They all need to be separated somehow. So we have a central sulcus. That central sulcus actually separates the precentral gyrus and the postcentral gyrus. So the precentral gyrus is in the frontal lobe. That postcentral gyrus is in the parietal lobe. We have a parieto-occipital sulcus. It tells you what it does. Separates the occipital and parietal lobes. We have a lateral sulcus. That gives us our two temporal lobes, one on each side. And again, just like we've been talking, that cerebral cortex, we have one on each side. And we have white matter and basal nuclei. Again, basal nuclei have specific jobs. Your cerebral cortex. This cerebral cortex, it's called or known as the executive suite because it does everything for the body. Because it makes you aware of what's going on around you. It lets you feel things. It lets you move. It lets you talk. It lets you remember what you're learning in class. And it lets you understand what's going on around you, what you're learning. Your cerebral cortex does everything for the body that allows you to be who you are. That cerebral cortex, it's pretty thin. It has different neuron cell bodies, dendrites. Those dendrites are what come off, those projections that come off the cell body. Glial cells. Glial cells are kind of those cells that help out with the immune system. We have blood vessels. Our brain uses a lot of oxygen just to function daily. The cerebral cortex does not have axons, and it makes up 40% of your brain's mass. That's quite a bit. So there's ways we can actually check different things that are happening in your cerebral cortex. We have a PET or an MRI scan. And that lets us check how there's motor areas in your brain that allows you to move and walk. There's sensory areas in your brain that lets you feel. So with these PET scans and MRI scans, we can see how these different areas function. And where each of these places function is called a domain. So if somebody is seeing something, this is the posterior part of the brain. And up here is that anterior portion. Just so you know what we're looking at on where things are happening. So seeing, yes, most of what you see is processed in that back occipital lobe. Hearing, well, that's mostly your temporal lobe. Speaking, it's kind of the frontal lobe, just a bit of that parietal lobe. But thinking uses a lot of your brain. Kind of cool to see how we can actually see how different portions of our brain are used for different things. So, our cerebral cortex, of course, is going to be split up into different areas. We have a motor area. That's what allows you to walk, talk, run, get from one place to the next. We have sensory areas. Of course, that's going to let you feel, let you know if you've got something sharp, hot, cold, painful. All these, we've got parts of our brain that detect all of that. And then we have association areas. So association areas takes information from different areas and it kind of helps to integrate some of that stuff. Your right side of your brain deals with the left side of your body. The left side of your brain deals with the right side of your body. Our brain can do lateralization or specialization. And it only can happen in one hemisphere. So conscious behavior involves that entire cortex somehow. So watching TV, typing a report, you're consciously doing something. So that involves that entire cortex in one way or another. So let's start breaking down the different portions of the brain here. We have a motor area. That motor area of our brain is in the frontal lobe, both on the right and the left side. And that's what allows you to do different voluntary movements like running, jumping, walking, writing. That's all done in that frontal lobe. We have a primary motor cortex in that precentral gyrus. We have a premotor cortex. We have what is called a Broca's area and a frontal eye field. So let's look here. Our primary motor cortex is this portion in dark red. It's just before that central sulcus. In front of the primary motor cortex, we have the premotor cortex. And in front of the premotor cortex, we have the frontal eye field. Broca's area is this portion through here. These are the main areas of our motor cortex. So here's this view from the brain being split in half. You still see that primary motor cortex, the premotor cortex, the frontal eye field. We don't see the Broca's area because it's more on the outside. So that primary motor cortex, somatic is muscle, motor moves. So that primary motor cortex is located, so we said, in that precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe. In that motor cortex, we have what are called pyramidal cells. Pyramidal cells, well, our nervous system is made up of neurons, So they're large neurons. Because that allows us to control what we're doing. Controls what you're writing right now. Controls what you're listening or what you're doing at this very moment. Because it allows precise. So it's going to allow you to write. So it's legible. It allows skilled. Again, writing is a skilled activity. And skeletal muscle movements. Well, you're using your skeletal muscles when you write something down. These pyramidal cells are part of this pyramidal or corticospinal tract. And this pyramidal or corticospinal tract are made up of some pretty long axons because they go down into that spinal cord. We need neurons that go down to the spinal cord to help differentiate what to do. We have a somatotopy. Somatotopy is how every muscle can be mapped in your motor cortex. So every muscle in your body has specific neurons that deal with it in the brain. And what we call this somotopy is a motor homunculi or homunculus. We have one on each side of the body, contralateral. So the one on the right side deals with the left side of the body. The one on the left side deals with the right side of the body. And it's where your brain deals with specific areas. We're going to look at the one in red first, because the red is the motor cortex. The blue, when we get to the sensory, we'll look at the sensory again. So as you can see, as we work down this entire cortex, that primary motor cortex I showed you up here, this is where this homunculus takes place. This is where neurons come in from every part of the body. Because that is where we swallow. There's the muscles with swallowing, the muscles that let your tongue move, moves your jaw, your lips, your face, your eyes, and your eyebrows. Then we go to the neck, thumb, fingers, even down to our hand, wrist, elbow, arm, shoulder, trunk, hip, knee, foot, toes, genitals. Genitals are on both sides. This goes over to this side as well. This is the order that all of our motor muscles deal with. So in front of that primary motor cortex, we said was the premotor cortex. Well, that premotor cortex is going to help you kind of plan whatever movement you're trying to do. It comes into that premotor cortex. It allows you to stage, okay, what am I doing? I'm running, or I'm walking, or I'm trying to write specific letters. And it plans out exactly how that movement is going to take place. Your premotor cortex allows you to learn new movements, new activities. It allows for repetitive movements like walking, running, or even patterned motor skills. Like playing the piano, that's a patterned motor skill. That specifically allows you to do certain patterned movements. Walking's a patterned movement. Running's a patterned movement. Even writing is a patterned movement in one form or another. So that premotor cortex is going to send out down to the body voluntary actions based off of what sensory information the brain had received. Broca's area. I showed where Broca's area is on the brain. It's usually in the left hemisphere. It's only on one side. That is how speech production occurs. Speech production usually will come from that left side of that left hemisphere, and it allows you to move your mouth, your tongue, to make specific words. Our frontal eye field, when we get to the last chapter of this class, we're going to look at special senses, and we're going to look at those 6 muscles that help move your eyeballs. There's 6 muscles attached to each eye. How your eyes move, those muscles help move your eyes. That's done in that frontal eye field. That's all voluntary eye movement. So here is, again, you see that primary motor cortex. That is where we have that motor homunculus of where activities for each specific part of the body is planned and sends out information. We have the premotor cortex. That is where planning occurs on how you're going to move. That frontal eye field, well, that's where your eyes move. Broca's area, that's how you talk. Same picture from before here. You can see it from looking at the inside of the brain. So what happens if you have a stroke or some kind of damage to that primary motor cortex? Well, if there's damage to specific areas of that motor cortex, any of the muscles that are controlled by the area damaged becomes paralyzed. And how we've mentioned, right side of the brain controls the left side of the body, the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. It's the damage is going to be opposite, or the paralysis, being paralyzed, is going to be opposite the side of the brain that has the actual damage. Your muscle strength isn't impaired. Being able to perform certain movements, but control over that movement is lost. So if we have damage, this is an example from your book, to the premotor area, you could still move your fingers, but that voluntary control needed to type would be lost. So your fingers can still move around, but you can't actually type out anything. You can't write anything. Our brain is pretty powerful. It does some really cool stuff. Because if a certain part of the brain dies because of the stroke or something, you can retrain your brain to do things. Other areas of the brain will pick up the tasks of something that was lost. So say you lost this ability to type. You can retrain your brain to use a different area of the brain to actually type. It's kind of cool. Your brain is pretty impressive. It does a lot of really cool things. Just like our motor area of the brain, we have a sensory area. That sensory area is behind the motor area. We have our primary somatosensory cortex, somatosensory association cortex, visual, auditory, vestibular, olfactory, gustatory, and visceral sensory area. Auditory, that's our hearing. Visual, that's our seeing. Vestibular, that's your balance. Olfactory, that's your smell. Gustatory, that's your taste. There's areas in your brain that for each and every one of those. So just how that motor cortex was in the frontal lobe, the somatosensory, the primary somatosensory is in the parietal lobes. And that's where we receive information. Your skin, proprioceptors. Those are some of those neurons that help kind of determine what's going on. You have proprioceptors in our skeletal muscles, joints, and tendons. We have spatial discrimination, how our nerves can be stimulated. Spatial discrimination lets us know where in the body something is happening. There's a really cool thing that's called 2-point touch, where you can touch somebody at with two different things at like so many inches apart. And as you get closer and closer, like they'll tell you they feel two things as you get closer and closer together. Eventually, even though there's two different things touching them, they're only going to feel one of them. It's kind of interesting. It's kind of cool. It's fun to play with. So just like we have a motor cortex we looked at, I showed you there was a sensory one. Well, here's the somatosensory one. Again, it's those same caricatures. And it's on the opposite side of the body. So what we feel on the right side goes to the left side of the brain. What we feel on the left side of the body goes to the right side of the brain. So it's pretty similar. There's a little bit of difference between the sensory and the motor. Our intra-abdominal. So what we're feeling in our whole abdominal area. That pharynx, that's down in the back of our throat, down where our voice box is. Our tongue, jaw, gums, teeth, lips, face, nose, eyes, thumb, fingers, hands, your forearm, elbow, arm, your whole head, neck, trunk, hip, leg, knees, foot, all the way down to the genitals. That is where how your sensory homunculus is all set up. This is what allows you to feel different things, and what you're feeling at that specific spot goes to this specific place in the sensory cortex. Like if something touched your fingers, this is the part of the brain that would feel it. If you're eating something, your tongue is moving something or moving food around, that is where your tongue specifically feels something. So just like we have a motor association cortex, we have a somatosensory association cortex. And it is just behind the primary somatosensory cortex. And that helps to kind of integrate, bring things together of what is happening. It'll determine how big is this something that's touching you? What's the texture? Especially with food. Some people have texture problems with issues with what foods they're eating. That all comes from that somatosensory association cortex. Helps to create that relationship of what's being touched. Like as you grab a hold of a water bottle, it allows you to feel what is in your hands if you're not even looking at it, so you know. We have visual areas in our brain. We have a primary visual or striate cortex. Remember when we looked at those pictures of the brain lit up in different areas depending on what that person's brain was doing? Remember how visual was all the way at the back of the brain? It's at that posterior tip of the occipital lobes. We have what is called a calcarine sulcus, and that primary visual cortex is kind of back in there. And that is what processes information that is going in through your eyes. So whatever you're looking at right now is being projected in that primary visual cortex. We have visual association areas. And that is all around that primary visual cortex. And association, if people like to study using association, it's where you take past experiences and you use past experiences to interpret what you are seeing at this very moment. It incorporates color, form, and or movement. Like that visual association area, that allows you to recognize somebody's face of somebody you've seen before. It may not always help remember the name, but you can recognize somebody's face based off of that visual association area. So processing of what you're seeing, it's going to take the entire posterior part of your cerebral hemisphere just to process what you're seeing. It's kind of it Your brain does a lot of really cool stuff. How about that auditory? What you're hearing right now? Well, what you initially hear at this very moment goes into that primary auditory cortex, which is at the top part of the temporal lobe. It allows you to determine the pitch of something. How loud is it? And the location, like where is it coming from? Like, is it coming from your computer? Coming from the TV? Are you hearing noises from outside? That is all being determined at that primary auditory cortex. That association, again, it's going to associate with stuff you've heard before, like memories of specific sounds, like some kind of alarm or siren going off. You've got memory of that. So when you hear that, again, it could cause some kind of warning in your system, but it allows you to permit perception. What's going on? What kind of sound is this? Where have I heard this sound before? All of that is coming from the auditory association cortex. Vestibular, that's your balance. That's what allows you to stay on your 2 feet when you walk and not fall over with every step you take. That's going to be in that insula. Remember, that's inside, it's deep inside the brain to that temporal lobe, part of that parietal and frontal lobe. That's where that vestibular cortex. It's also part of that parietal cortex is going to be that vestibular. And it'll let you know where you are in space. So when we get again to those special senses, we'll see exactly how your ears work specifically to keep you balanced. And that's why it's specifically the head in space, because that vestibular area, the cortex is in the brain, but we have vestibular portion in our ear that allows us to determine our balance and our specific position at that moment. Olfactory, smell. So our primary olfactory cortex, it's kind of in that temporal lobe. It's part of that rhinencephalon. Along with we have olfactory bulbs and tracts, because we need to be able to determine what we smell. Part of that rhinencephalon becomes part of our limbic system, because our limbic system kind of deals with emotions. So sometimes you get a certain smell and it gives you a certain emotion, like you smell a skunk. That's going to elicit some kind of emotion, because it's like, ew, get away. It makes you aware of odors in general. What do you smell? You smell cologne, perfume. Do you smell fresh grass cut? It makes you conscious of these smells, even if you don't want to be conscious of them. Your brain is still working to make you conscious of them. Gustatory. Gustatory is your taste. It's in that insula. And it allows you to know what you're tasting. Aware of tasting something, what you're tasting, all of that comes from that gustatory cortex. Visceral. Visceral has anything to do with your abdomen, any of those organs in there. Visceral is behind that gustatory. And it allows you to kind of feel. It lets you know when you're hungry. Your stomach hurts. You ate something that didn't agree with your stomach. Your bladder's full. You need to go empty your bladder. All of that comes from that visceral sensory area. So let's look. We have that primary somatosensory cortex, which is this dark blue. And just behind it, somatosensory association cortex. You can see that gustatory, they're pointing to the insula that's deep behind that temporal lobe. We have that vestibular cortex, which is also in that insula that allows you to know where you are in space with balance. Primary visual cortex, it's at that posterior tip of that occipital lobe where we talked about. Then our visual association area, that surrounds that primary visual cortex. You have that auditory association cortex, with the primary auditory cortex. So there's a lot going on in here. Is your brain, remember, is that master suite. It regulates everything. So here you can get a better view. You see that primary somatosensory cortex with the somatosensory association cortex. You see where that primary visual cortex is. It looked like it was that little part, but it goes deep in with the association area all around it. Get that primary olfactory cortex. And then they kind of cut away the insula so we don't really see the rest. What happens if we have some kind of damage to that primary visual cortex? It creates functional blindness. If somebody's visual association area gets damaged, they can see everything just fine. They just don't know what they're looking at. They can't, they could be looking out the window. They see stuff, but they don't know what that stuff is. They don't know that it's grass, trees, a road, people, sidewalk. That they can't determine any of that because that visual association area is damaged. So we have other association areas throughout our brain. These different association areas help put everything together. It helps us store something in memory. So when you learn something, it puts it into memory so you don't forget it. Gives meaning to something, that information. Helps you tie a past experience. They'll decide on what actions you take for something. Allows for sensations, thoughts, emotions, because it makes us who we are. We have an anterior association area, posterior association area, and a limbic association area. So let's look at what these do. Our anterior association area is known as the prefrontal cortex. It's involved with intellect, how smart you are, cognition, recall, important on tests. That anterior association area helps you recall stuff as you read test questions. It allows you to go through and remember what you are hearing or recall what you see when you read a question. Even your personality. That all comes from that anterior association area. Your working memory. So when you go through and say read these PowerPoints, that goes into your working memory. It's not there long term. It's only there for when you look at it and read it, and then it kind of goes away. That is why just reading a PowerPoint, then taking a test does not work, especially with anatomy. Because that's where, I know I stated the first day of class, repetition is what will put something from this working short-term memory into long-term memory. Our working memory also helps us with abstract ideas. Like, how does a nerve from your big toe go all the way up to your brain? When you stub your toe, how does it let you know how painful that is? That's kind of an abstract idea for your brain. Judgment. You need that judgment area so you don't go do something stupid. Reasoning allows you to look at more than one side of things. Persistence. Planning. That all is done in that anterior association area. How about that posterior association area? Well, it's in that temporal, parietal, and occipital lobes. It allows you to recognize some patterns in different things. It's how you recognize somebody's face of someone you've seen before. Lets us know where we are in space. That is how we understand what you're looking at this very moment and what you're hearing. That's all done in the posterior association area known as Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area specifically allows you to understand what you're seeing and hearing at this very moment. How about that limbic association area? Well, limbic is part of that limbic system. So it's in what's called the cingulate gyrus, the parahippocampal gyrus, and the hippocampus. That is the part of the brain that it is located in. Emotional impact. It allows you to make memories, remember memories, good or bad sometimes, but allows you to remember a specific emotion to something happening. So if something like that were to happen again, that is where that emotion comes out a lot faster than it did the first time. Sometimes we get tumors, could be some kind of stroke to that anterior association area. And if somebody has a mental or a personality disorder, they could have a tumor or some kind of lesion to that anterior association. They lose the ability to make sound judgments. They can't pay attention to things. They lose their inhibitions. They don't realize doing certain things that they're doing is not appropriate. So this as it becomes oblivious of social restraints, doing things that are not appropriate to be done in public. They lose that ability to realize that this is not something I should be doing. They just go do a whatever. They don't care what they look like. They could take some risks, do something that they would never have done before. These can be some signs that something is not right. But what happens if we have a lesion, a tumor, or something to that posterior association area? They don't take care of themselves. And whatever side that lesion is on, they're not going to take care of that one side of the body that lesion is on, or the opposite side of that body that lesion is on, because they don't think that belongs to them. If they had a lesion on the left side of their brain in the posterior association area, they think that their right hand or arm doesn't belong to them. So they don't have to take care of it. So our brain, as I kind of mentioned at the beginning of this PowerPoint, does a lot of lateralization. And lateralization kind of divides the jobs between hemispheres, between right and left hemispheres. And it kind of just depends on what specific stimulation is coming in. Because your right and your left hemisphere are not identical. One side is better at one thing versus one side is better at something else. And that is where that cerebral dominance comes into play. Most of us have a left-sided dominance. If you have a left-sided dominance, you usually have right-handedness. So you write with your right hand. The other 10%, they have more of a right hemisphere dominance. So those of us that are left-sided, left-brained, you're good with language, math, logic. Someone who is right hemisphere, they have really good visual spatial skills, intuition, emotion. They're pretty artistic and musical. And say that's the difference between my sister and I. I'm left-sided dominance, she's right-sided dominance. It's a huge difference between the right and the left side. Each person is good at different things depending on which hemisphere dominates them. But our hemispheres communicate pretty well because we've got all these fiber tracks. We'll go through them in this PowerPoint. But these fiber tracks help the left and the right side of the brain talk to each other. They help to kind of integrate what's happening between that right and that left side. So now that we kind of looked at the motor and the sensory cortex and the association areas, let's look at what this white matter and this gray matter is and does. So the cerebral white matter. That cerebral white matter helps to communicate between that right and left cortex, between different areas of the cerebellum or the cerebrum, and it communicates with the lower central nervous system. So nerves that are coming from that spinal cord or going down that spinal cord, that is all done through that cerebral white matter. Again, white matter is myelinated fibers, and they're in what are called tracts. Tracts are what allow nerves to travel from one area to another. So they have association, commiseral, and projection type fibers in this white matter. Association fibers. Association fibers are going to stay in that one hemisphere. So they're going to communicate between different parts of the same hemisphere, while commiseral are going to communicate between the two hemispheres. Projection fibers. They help to connect the hemispheres to the lower brain and or the spinal cord. As part of these projection fibers, we have an internal capsule. This internal capsule has fibers on each side of the brain stem, and they pass between the thalamus and some basal nuclei. Corona radita, those are fibers that go through the cerebral white matter to the cortex. So they go different places depending on what they are part of. So here is a drawing and an actual brain. You can see all that different white matter is just the white in the real brain. But then you can see all the different fibers. They have them colored to help see where they go. We have these association fibers in pink. They stay in the same hemisphere, but they help to connect the different parts of that same hemisphere. Commissural fibers, they're going to go between the two hemispheres to help connect what's happening with the right and the left side of the body. Those projection fibers, they come from different areas. They could come from the spinal cord. They could come from the lower part of the brain. They help to kind of connect everything that's happening in the body with the cerebrum. Here's another view in both a regular brain, or a drawing of a brain, and a real brain. You can see those association fibers as they go through all the different areas of the brain. Those commissural fibers, those are all those little green dots, because we're looking at a parasagittal cut. So you can see that they go between that right and left hemisphere, but we're only seeing one side of that. That's why it's all those little green dots. And projection fibers. You see that internal capsule. You see this internal capsule? You see all these? That's all part of that internal capsule. Corona radita. That is found through some of here. Going on up. That is all part of these different fibers that help put two and two together. Let's look at some of these nuclei. I talked about how specific nuclei have specific jobs. So let's look at what some of these nuclei do. We have different nuclei, again, that do different things. And for basal nuclei specifically, we have a caudate nucleus, a putamen, and a globus pallidus. You can see where some of these are. You can see that caudate nucleus, the putamen, all within this area of the brain. So what does a basal nuclei do? Well, they're going to help influence your muscle movement. How does your muscles move? That basal nuclei is going to help. Cognition and emotion. That's going to help. They're going to help regulate the intensity of a slow or stereotyped movement, like walking, running. We have parts of our brain, because a lot of our brain up in that cerebral cortex, it sends out general information of this is what to like this is what you should be doing. But then there's other parts of the brain that fine tune it, that get rid of making sure that the movements that are being sent out are correct. So that basal nuclei is going to get rid of those incorrect movements or maybe an inappropriate response. Now, some people say things with, they say that they talk without speaking or thinking sometimes. Their basal nuclei is helping to try to filter out those inappropriate responses that some people say. They're going to inhibit antagonistic. Like if you want to flex your arm, a bicep curl, it's going to inhibit the triceps, so it allows your biceps to flex. It gets rid of unnecessary movements, like Parkinson's disease and Huntington's. These two diseases specifically affect that basal nuclei. These people usually have some kind of tremor at all times going. They also have a lot of they have a lot of movements they try to do, but they can't, they're not always done correctly. They don't think before they speak per se. Anything and everything just comes out of their mouth because nothing is inhibiting them from saying inappropriate things. So here's the drawing, and then you can see in the real brain, that putamen, the caudate nucleus, the globus pallidus. You can see the tail of the caudate nucleus. That makes up a lot of those basal nuclei. How about this diencephalon? That diencephalon has the thalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus. And they're all by that third ventricle. So here's our thalamus, our epithalamus, and our hypothalamus. So our thalamus is all through here. Hypothalamus comes down through here. Epithalamus is this light purple portion in the back. That makes up this entire diencephalon. Here it is on a real brain. And you have that hypothalamus, the thalamus, and the epithalamus. Part of that thalamus, or hypothalamus. That thalamus in here. Even that epithalamus back here. That makes up all of that. So what does the thalamus do? Thalamus is most of that diencephalon. And it is a bilateral nuclei, bilateral, so it's on both sides of the brain, and it is connected by interthalamic adhesions. So here is the diencephalon. We get those thalamic nuclei. But the thalamus takes information that is coming into the cortex. So it goes, as information comes up that spinal cord, it goes through the thalamus first, and it kind of sorts that information. Where does it need to go? It edits that information so we know what's actually going on. And then it's going to send it to the right part of the brain. So that hypothalamus helps to deal with emotion and your visceral function. So digesting of food, bladder bowel functions, something coming from the cerebellum. And those basal nuclei, they're going to help direct those motor cortices. It also helps for memory or sensory integration. So it mediates. It's one of those mediators. Motor activities, cortical arousal, learning, memory. It kind of mediates kind of acts as a relay station for all that information and sends it where it needs to go. As we looked hypothalamus, hypo means low or below. So hypothalamus is below the thalamus. It has mammillary bodies that helps olfactory. So your smell. The hypothalamus has the infundibulum, and that's what connects the pituitary gland to the brain. It is all done at that hypothalamus. You can see the hypothalamus, it has all these different nuclei in there. A lot of them, each of those little balloons, it kind of looks like, all deals with different information. And then we have that infundibulum that attaches that pituitary gland to the actual brain. So that hypothalamus does a lot of the visceral controlling. That is stuff that we have no control over. And it helps to maintain and regulate homeostasis because we need to keep our body functioning as efficiently as possible. So it helps to control that autonomic nervous system. That is stuff we have no control over. Like blood pressure, we can't control that. Heartbeat, heart rate, digestive tract motility, again, no control. Pupil size, no control. Your pupil size will change when you go from light to dark or dark to light. But it also initiates responses. Pleasure, fear, rage, even your biological rhythms and your sex drive all comes from that hypothalamus. We talked about homeostasis, so of course it's got to regulate the body temperature. Hunger, satiety, so when you're hungry, when you're full, that comes from the hypothalamus. Tells you when to drink water. Those sleep-wake cycles. The suprachiasmatic nucleus is specific to our biological clock. The hypothalamus also controls that pituitary gland and pituitary hormones. There's a lot of hormones from the pituitary gland that you'll learn about in Anatomy 2 in the endocrine system. So what happens if we have a lesion, a tumor, or something in that hypothalamus. Well, that regulates our hunger and lets us know when we're full. So if you're never being told that your body doesn't tell you you're hungry, your brain doesn't say you're hungry, you're going to start wasting away. Or you're going to eat and you don't know when to stop. You're not going to be able to sleep well. You're going to be dehydrated because that's what tells you to drink water. You're not going to be able to control your emotions. Cry when you should be laughing. Laughing when you should be crying. They said tumors, radiation, surgery, even trauma can affect that hypothalamus. How about that epithalamus? That epithalamus has what is called your pineal gland. Your pineal gland is what makes your melatonin for your sleep-wake cycle. It's very important. Well, here is that pineal gland in the back portion of that epithalamus. Along with that hypothalamus, this whole area tells you you're hungry or you're full, you sleep, you're thirsty, you're not. All of that comes from there. And here it is again on a real brain. Here is another view. We're going to start looking into the brainstem, but you can kind of see here that diencephalon with the thalamus, the hypothalamus, all in there. Because the thalamus is this big purple section. The hypothalamus is this little area in here. Here's another view. You see that thalamus really well. And you have that hypothalamus through here. Another view. Your thalamus. Your hypothalamus is in here with that pineal gland. Let's go into what the brainstem does, because the brainstem is part that starts to lead down to that spinal cord. Our brainstem consists of a midbrain, a pons, and a medulla oblongata. And again, it's going to contain nuclei for specific jobs, and it's going to have white matter surrounding all of that. Your brainstem, automatic behaviors for survival. Remember I talked about before, breathing, heart rate. That's all controlled in your brainstem because you need that for survival. It also has fiber tracts because fibers are going to go through the midbrain or through that brainstem as it goes up to the brain. So that's how we have to that's how we connect the brain or the spinal cord to the actual cortex. We also have those nuclei. We have nuclei that are associated with some of our cranial nerves. Our cranial nerves, we'll go through what each of them are, not in the peripheral nervous system, but our cranial nerves are nerves that come directly off the brain and serve different regions. Most of them are to the head. There's one that is not. But that is what specifically our cranial nerves are. So as you can see, this is the underside of the brain where you can start to see that brain stem with the midbrain, the pons, the medulla oblongata, and that leads down to the spinal cord. All of these things coming off here, all these are cranial nerves that come directly off the brain, even down through here. Each of those nerves serves different purposes, and we will learn what they do at another time. So our midbrain, we have our diencephalon above and our pons below. We have what are called cerebral peduncles. And they are ventral, so they're on the front part of that brain, or that brain stem. And they have pyramidal motor tracts. So motor tracts are coming out of the brain down to the spinal cord to initiate some kind of movement. We have a cerebral aqueduct. Remember we talked about when we talked about the ventricles? That's what connects our third and fourth ventricle, is that cerebral aqueduct. Well, that's found in the midbrain. We have periaqueductal gray matter. These are more nuclei. They're going to help with pain suppression. Like if something hurts, there's nerves down in your body that if something is in pain, it'll constantly send information up to the cerebrum, sensory information saying, I'm hurting, I'm hurting, I'm hurting, I'm hurting, I'm hurting, over and over and over again. Well, this periaqueductal gray matter will suppress some of those pain signals. So not all of them goes to the brain. Because remember when we talked about in muscles, the more a muscle, the more action potentials that are sent to that specific muscle, the more muscle fibers work together to contract. Well, it kind of works similar with nerves. The more action potentials that are coming through, the stronger that pain signal is. Well, sometimes that periaqueductal gray matter is going to suppress some of those signals, so not every single one of them gets up to your brain, so your pain is not necessarily felt as intense as your nerves are saying it is. Your brain kind of modulates that. Your periaqueductal gray deals with that fight or flight response. So that anxiety that you may feel if something were to happen. We have nuclei for cranial nerve 3, oculomotor, and cranial nerve 4 are your trochlear nerves. Those go to your eyeball, the muscles around your eyes. And there's another one that does too. There's 3 cranial nerves specifically. So here is our midbrain, a nice midbrain slice. We see that cerebral aqueduct that connects that third and fourth ventricle. Then we have those fibers of those pyramidal tracts. You see, this is a cerebral peduncle, is this whole bulge that comes out. That is that cerebral peduncle. Then we have different nuclei in here, we have our nuclei, as I said, for that oculomotor 3 nerve. We have other nuclei in here. They all do different things. So, as we just looked at that picture, we have a corpora quadrigemma, which includes that superior colliculi and inferior colliculi. Superior is your visual reflex. Think reflex. You get a bright flash of light. That's what tells that your eyes, you close your eyes when you get that. That's a reflex. Inferior colliculi is an auditory relay center. So information from that auditory nerve goes through that inferior colliculi before it goes to the brain. That substantia nigra, it's linked to that basal nuclei. So in Parkinson's, they have degeneration. We have a red nucleus. That red nucleus has descending limb flexion motor pathways. So it tells you to flex your arm up, flex that bicep, flex your hip to pick your leg up. That's all flexion type movements. That goes through the red nucleus. So here's that red nucleus. That's substantia nigra. Here's that superior colliculus. And there's no inferior colliculus on there. But here's another way to look at it. We do have these models that look similar to this in the lab. You can see in that brain stem, we have that, our whole midbrain, it comes through here. What about our pons? That's the next one down. We have our midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata. Well, it's between the midbrain, so the midbrain is above and the medulla oblongata is below. We also have our fourth ventricle. And that's what separates that pons from the cerebellum. Cerebellum is in the inferior posterior portion of our brain. We have conduction tracts that go through the pons. They are fibers that connect higher brain centers and the spinal cord together. Of course, we need information coming from the body going up to the brain. It needs to get there somehow, and it's going to follow tracks. It's also going to relay information between motor cortex and the cerebellum. That cerebellum helps to completely fine-tune movements. We also have our cranial nerve 5 or trigeminal nerve, cranial nerve 6, abducens nerve, and cranial nerve 7, our facial nerve that comes out of our pons specifically. We have some nuclei that make that reticular formation. And in our pons, it tells you to breathe. Unknowingly, it tells you when to breathe and when not to breathe. So here is the pons. You can see that fourth ventricle that goes through that pons. We still have that reticular formation. We have our cranial nerves coming out. We have fiber tracts. We have different nuclei. Once again, medulla oblongata or medulla. This is found at the foramen magnum. So this is the lowest part of our brain and brain stem before we get to the spinal cord. That medulla oblongata has that fourth ventricle. It has that central canal that goes down into that spinal cord. It has choroid plexus. A plexus is usually deals with capillaries. And our capillaries, that choroid plexus specifically, makes our cerebrospinal fluid. So it's coming, cerebrospinal fluid is coming from that capillaries, but it's not coming from the red blood cells. It's coming more from that plasma because we have a blood-brain barrier in our brain. So blood doesn't get into our cerebrospinal fluid specifically. It should not have any blood in it. If it does, it signifies some kind of problem. So again, we have those pyramidal tracts that go from the motor cortex. It's going to be found in the pons. It's found in the medulla. The fibers or the nerves that are going down from those motor cortex. Remember how they go, like your left side of your brain controls the right side of your body movement? Well, those, as these fibers are coming down, they're going to cross over in the medulla. So as the fibers come down, they switch sides in the medulla as they go down. We have olives in our brain. These olives, we have an inferior olivary nuclei, stretch information. So as you're walking, as you're moving, it relays it as how muscles stretch, how your joints move up to your brain. We have cranial nerves 8, 9, 10, and 12 and coming out of the medulla. We have a vestibular and cochlear nuclei. Vestibular, balance, equilibrium. Nucleus cuteus and nucleus gracilis. That is where sensory information coming from your body into your spinal cord go up to the brain, and then it goes to that primary sensory cortex from there. So your medulla does a lot of stuff. Here is that medulla oblongata. We still have part of that fourth ventricle. Here's the choroid plexus that's going to make our cerebrospinal fluid specifically. We have several different nuclei. We have our pyramidal tracts. We have that olivary nucleus. We have our caudate nucleus and our nucleus gracilis. We have our cochlear nuclei. All of this, remember, this is where fiber tracts switch over from that left side of the body, left brain, it switches over to the right side of the body. The information coming from that right side of the brain switches over to the left side to go out to the left side of the body. So here is that brain all the way down. You see that medulla oblongata down here at the bottom. This is where that foramen magnum is in the skull, to where the brain actually turns into that spinal cord. Your medulla also functions as that autonomic reflex center. It does a lot of the same jobs as the hypothalamus. That hypothalamus helps to relay information that your medulla is helping to guide as well. We have our cardiovascular center in our medulla specifically. How hard and how fast our heart contracts is controlled in the medulla. The size of our blood vessels is controlled in our medulla. Respiratory centers. How often and how deep you breathe. The rhythm of your breathing. Vomiting, hiccuping, swallowing, coughing, sneezing. That's all done in that medulla oblongata as well. So it does a lot of stuff. Let's look at the cerebellum. Next, our cerebellum. It's 11% of your brain mass. So it's pretty tiny. And it's behind, dorsal means behind the pons and the medulla. It takes information from the cortex, the brain stem, and sensory receptors. It provides precise, controlled, coordinated movement. So as motor information is coming down from that motor cortex, it's going to go through the cerebellum as its last stop before it goes out to your body. That cerebellum helps to regulate what muscles are used, at what force it's used, allows you to write specific letters neatly. It allows your muscles to move in the correct strength to do the correct movements. It lets you balance. It helps to keep you balanced so you're not falling over with every step you take. Just like your cerebrum has hemispheres, so does your cerebellum. And they're connected by what is called a vermis. We have folia in the cerebellum, which are the gyri from the cerebellum. They're transversely, so they kind of all go across. Our cerebellum, you know how tiny it is? It's got 3 hemispheres. Got an anterior, posterior, and a flocculonodular hemisphere. It has gray matter and white matter. The white matter is called arbor vitae. We also have Purkinje fibers. Purkinje fibers come from that cortex. They go into that cerebellum. They're going to connect with another nerve in that cerebellum to help communicate things. Just like our cerebrum has a homunculus, so does our cerebellum. So here is that cerebellum. You see that anterior lobe with the arbor vitae, which is that white matter, the folia, those transverse gyri. You see this posterior lobe. You see how it's connected by the pons and even by that medulla. So here again, you see the anterior lobe, posterior lobe. Here, they have labeled out the flacculonodular lobe. And you can see how everything is connected. We have these cerebellar peduncles that are actually part of the brain stem that sends information from that brain stem into the cerebellum, and then it comes back out by that way before it goes down or back up to the brain. Here is another view. You can see that vermis from this angle. See the anterior lobe? You see the primary fissure that separates. Then you see the posterior lobe. So those peduncles I just talked about, I pointed out in that picture before. In the cerebellar peduncles, the fibers are ipsilateral, so the same side of the body. Ipsilateral is same side, contralateral is opposite side. And we have fiber tracts, of course, that are connecting the cerebellum to that brainstem. Those are those peduncles I mentioned. The superior cerebellar peduncle goes from the cerebellum to the midbrain. The middle cerebellar peduncle pons to the cerebellum, and that inferior cerebellar peduncle medulla to the cerebellum. So it connects the different areas. So here again, those three peduncles. The superior, of course, is the highest, middle, then inferior. So how do we process information coming in from the cerebellum? Well, as I said, it fine-tunes your activity. So as information comes from that primary or comes from that motor cortex, it's going to go into the cerebellum. So it's going to receive that information. Because that cerebellum or the cerebrum is telling that, sending information out saying, okay, this is what we want to do to initiate some kind of muscle contraction. It also receives information from proprioceptors. So some of those nerves. Also visual information, equilibrium, your balance. So all of that information, your cerebellum puts all of that information together. What movement your brain says it wants to do, what you're seeing, where you're at in space, all that comes together. And these pathways are constantly telling your cerebellum, this is what's happening with your body at this very second. Your cerebellum actually coordinates. It figures out the best way to make your muscles work correctly. So then it sends out that information on what to do. So it's going to send that information to the cerebellar motor cortex, or cerebral motor cortex, sorry, and then to the different brainstem nuclei. So your cerebellum does the main processing, putting everything together to form that movement. They've even found that your cerebellum can play a role in how you think, language, and emotion. It may also do some higher functions. And then it'll help adjust those higher functions accordingly. So here's those homunculi that I talked about, just how your cerebrum has the motor homunculus, so does that cerebellum. This is the end of part 1. We will pick up with part 2 in the next video. So thank you very much. Bye.